Hello and welcome back to my channel. Now it's a bit of a sad day on the channel this week because we're marking the passing of Terence Davies, who died last weekend at the age of 77. One of the best filmmakers working in the last 30-40 years, certainly one of the best British filmmakers. I think arguably the best British filmmaker to have been working in the last half century, to be honest. So I thought I'd mark his passing with a top 10. A few words about Terence Davies first. When I first came across his films and I saw his films about English life in the sort of post-war period, films like Distant Voices, Still Lives and The Long Day Closes, I kind of rejected them actually. And I rejected them because all my life I'd been brought up on that kind of social realism, that kind of Ken Loach, Mike Leigh, Stephen Frears kind of world of social realism, sort of middle class artists and intellectuals talking about how grim life was up north and working class and what they have to go through. And I found those films rather patronising. I grew up in I grew up in Nottingham, sort of north of England, to working class parents, and I felt that the vision of working class life, and particularly northern life, was rather patronising and rather condescending and rather samey, you know. And so I rejected those films, and because Terence Davies seemed to me to be in that scheme, I rejected them initially. I also rejected them because I found at first Terence Davies' style was too stately. It was all these kind of cameras slowly going into a terraced house doorway, very sort of hushed, with lots of soundtrack playing over. It felt like it was memorialising English working class life instead of bringing it to life, bringing out the rawness of it. But actually, strangely enough, ironically, it was when Terence Davies started to move outwards from that and do material from other countries, like Edith Wharton's book, The House of Mirth, John Kennedy Toole's book, The Neon Bible, that I started to realise that this was more Terence Davies' way of seeing. It was his aesthetic. It wasn't just about memory and memorialising and nostalgia. It was just his way of seeing, his use of music, his use of style that was organic and was idiosyncratic to him. I think what I realised was that Terence Davies was doing his own thing completely. He wasn't fitting into any sort of system like English social realism. He developed his own aesthetic. I was talking to one of my subscribers about Michael Powell. I've just finished a retrospective of his work. And Michael Powell represented to me an English cinema. Not the English cinema that tries to ape Hollywood or that tries to ape European art cinema, which I think most British cinema tries to do, but a cinema that was in and of itself, that was English and wasn't looking to any other sort of, tradition. And Terence Davies was doing exactly the same thing. I think in some ways he's the true heir to Michael Powell, even though they're very different directors. What I like about Terence Davies is that he uses period drama, as a means of comment. You see, it's often thought that period costume dramas are an exercise in nostalgia, in going back to a nicer, simpler age, when things were more beautiful and people dressed in beautiful clothes. It's a kind of escapism, isn't it? But Terence Davies' period films are not escapism. First of all, they're the way he thinks, they're who he is. Terence Davies was quite an extraordinary person, actually. He hated modern popular culture and was very vociferous about it in interview. So much so, he didn't even like the Beatles. Terence Davies' interest in popular culture and world culture basically ends at the end of the 1950s. He didn't even like the Beatles, even though they were from Liverpool like he was. He rejects everything from that point. And he said something rather wonderful in an interview. He said, "I make films about the past because that's where I feel safe, and that's the world I understand." You and me both, Terry. You and me both. But it's not just an exercise in nostalgia. He's using it to point at questions about how we live now. You see, it's not true that only modern day social realism comments on who we are now. If we look at science fiction projects forward into the future and gives us all sorts of, scenarios or dystopias. But what it's really commenting on is where we are at the present and what we're doing in the present, what it might lead to, right? Similarly, if we go back to the past, we can hold the present to account. We can say, this is what we've lost. Why have we lost it? Why is where we are now necessarily better than this? And I think that's what Terence Davies at his best is doing. Davies was very uncompromising in his views. In an era of greater and greater PR management, celebrities being trained what to say and how to say it in the media, Davies just gave his honest opinion. Sometimes this upset people. In many interviews throughout his career, he said how when he discovered he was gay, it ruined his life. And this, of course, has upset many people. It's upset many people involved in gay pride, gay lobbyists and gay activists who want to promote homosexuality, make it more accepted and tolerated within society. And there you've got this director saying, no, actually, I hated it. And that might make Davies sound like a rather uncompromising extremist. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. I've been lucky enough and privileged enough to see Davies several times on stage live, either in interview or introducing a film. And he is the liveliest, warmest, funniest, most personable, most normal film director I think we've ever had. You could almost imagine Terence Davies, talking to him over your garden wall as your next door neighbour. He just looks like a normal guy and he speaks like a normal guy. I can imagine having a conversation with him saying, "Oh, Mike, I read T.S. Eliot's The Four Quartets again last night," and him quoting it to me, because I think he could quote the whole thing, and "I got my 4 CD Best of Doris Day. It's wonderful." He's such a wonderful guy. He's so straightforward, he's so generous, he's so forthright and honest. You couldn't take against him, no matter how strange his opinion seemed to be. That's just who he was. And it's that same sensibility that underscores all of his films. He's a remarkable man, and that's why I wanted to do this little tribute to him, because he had some very odd opinions, but he was a very normal yet passionate individual, one I think anyone could warm to. Let's get into my top 10 of his films. Now, at number 10, I've placed the first film he made outside England, which wasn't looking back at his childhood or his teenagehood, but went into different material. He adapted a novel called The Neon Bible by John Kennedy Toole, looking at the upbringing of a young boy in the Deep South in America in the 40s. I must admit, I'm placing this film 10th because I'm not particularly interested in the material or in how Terence Davies treated it. I'll also admit a terrible confession on this channel that I don't really like Gina Rowlands, who's the main actress in it. Look, I don't know why. Sometimes an actor or an actress doesn't agree with you. Everyone else is saying they're brilliant and they're geniuses. Gina Rowlands and I just rub each other up the wrong way. I don't really get what all the fuss is about. So this film doesn't appeal to me as much as it does to many people. In ninth place is Benediction. Benediction was the last film that Davies completed, and it's a portrait of Siegfried Sassoon, the great war poet. I remember reading Siegfried Sassoon's war poems when I was at school, along with Wilfred Owen, who also appears in the film, and I was very moved by them. Most children at school, in British schools, still learn these poems. The problem with Benediction is, beyond these poems, Siegfried Sassoon is not terribly interesting. After the war, where he was sort of objected to the war, and he was vilified for that, most of the film is taken up with his post-war experience, and it's basically just a series of affairs and, socialising in 1920s London, with him getting more and more bitter. And then eventually you have Peter Capaldi as an older Siegfried Sassoon looking back on his life, which is a structure that I don't think works at all. I think that the structure of this film doesn't function at all. And actually, it's a rather sloppy film. I actually think it's his least successful film as a film. It has a brilliant scene at the beginning with Ben Daniels as a psychiatrist, a sympathetic psychiatrist. Just a simple two-hander interview scene with him and Siegfried Sassoon that is beautifully acted and written. Apart from that, I don't think it works so well. In eighth place is The Deep Blue Sea, an adaptation of Terence Rattigan. Terence Rattigan was a famous playwright in Britain, 40s, 50s, and it's absolutely of the period that Terence Davies goes back to. That's his happy place. I suppose that's why he made it. I can't think of any other reason why he would make it, to be honest. It's a very sort of British middle-class drama about the wife of a judge having an affair with a fighter pilot. It's beautifully performed by Tom Hiddleston, Rachel Weisz, and Simon Russell Beale. Excellent cast. The period detail is immaculate. It's beautifully evoked. It's very moving, very adult piece. I think the reason why it comes so low on the list is because it didn't make as much impact on me as the other movies. It didn't feel as necessary and as vital, but it's well worth watching. In seventh place, A Quiet Passion. This was his penultimate film, made about the life of Emily Dickinson, portrayed by Cynthia Nixon. This is a beautiful, very well acted film. Jennifer Ely also plays a part in it. I wasn't terribly interested in Emily Dickinson going into this film, and I wasn't that interested in her going out of the film, if I'm completely honest. I thought it was a nice exercise, but I think, if anything, ironically, it lacked the passion of his other earlier movies. It has one extraordinary sequence where you have a sort of dream sequence in Emily Dickinson's mind where she imagines this, dark silhouette of a man coming to her doorway and coming to visit her in the night. We never know who it is. I think it's supposed to be her imagination of a romantic interlude or of her passion. Though it keeps reminding me of that line from Emily Dickinson, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. For some reason, I see it as death coming up the staircase to meet her. Maybe that's just my warped imagination. It's a sort of montage sequence, all done with a beautiful soundtrack, a madrigal, I believe, titled "Since First I Saw Your Face" by Thomas Ford. It's really, really beautiful sequence, one of the great sequences of Terence Davies' cinema. In sixth place is Of Time and the City. Now, look, this is a documentary about Liverpool, the history of Liverpool in the 20th century. Not everyone's idea of a good time. You know what? This is a comment on British cinema. Terence Davies hadn't been able to make a film. He hadn't got a film off the ground for 8 years when he made this film. And he was invited to make this film, and all he could make was a documentary about Liverpool. That tells you everything you need to know about the British film industry and the pedestrian taste of its producers. But anyway, Terence Davies being Terence Davies, he produced a little masterpiece. Even if you're not the slightest bit interested in Liverpool, I strongly advise you to watch this film. And there's a sequence in this film that took my breath away and moved me to tears. And it's a sequence where they show the terraced house slums of Liverpool being knocked down to make way for tower blocks. And the photo montage that Terence Davies uses, and he puts it to the soundtrack of Peggy Lee singing "The Folks Who Live on the Hill." I guarantee no one who watches that sequence will have a dry eye at the end of it. It is absolutely incredible. It's so beautiful, it's so moving, and it makes its point brilliantly. I saw Terence Davies introduce this film, and he said something during that introduction which has stayed with me, that he believed that what he wanted to evoke was the poetry of the working class and working people, a poetry to which they were entitled. I've never forgotten that phrase, and I think this film evokes the poetry of the working class as beautifully as any film I've ever seen. In fifth place, I think the film that I would nominate as Terence Davies' most underrated film, Sunset Song, which came out about 2015. I think this is a lovely, lovely film. It's an adaptation of a sort of classic novel that's not read these days, Lewis Gibbon's novel of the same name. And it's set in the sort of pre-war, pre-First World War period in Scotland. And it's simply about the life of a young woman, a farmer's daughter, meeting her young man. The young man, they get married, but the young man has to go off to fight in the First World War, and how that scars their marriage. It is such a beautiful, moving film. Davies's feel for period is immaculate. But what I really like about this film is, and this is one of the things I really love about Terence Davies, he refuses to be part of modern popular culture. He refuses to be part of this modern world of irony, of postmodernism, of meta-cinema. This is a book which, in modern terms, is quite cliched, right? The way it looks at love and marriage and, first love and engagement. It's quite cliched, it's old-fashioned. Davies doesn't care. He doesn't give a shit. He presents these cliches as if they're being presented for the first time with the passion and truth that he feels they deserve, because when he read the book, it moved him. It doesn't matter that these things have been played out in films 100 times. He's going to play them out as if for the first time. And I deeply admire that commitment and that completely uncompromising attitude. And there's a sequence in this film, I think it's about 10 or 15 minutes long, of their marriage. This young couple, this young man, this young woman, getting married, in a Scottish farming community. It is so beautiful. And there's no conflict, there's no irony, there's no dysfunction. It is just watching a community come together to celebrate the life and the love of these two people. And it's one of the most moving and vibrant sequences in modern cinema. You don't need all that fake conflict and fake drama. Just to see two people in love is enough. My fourth place choice is Terence Davies' most famous film, Distant Voices, Still Lives, which is his autobiographical portrait of his family. Actually, his family slightly before he came of age. So it's when he was a very young child. And his father was a very violent, angry man. There was a lot of domestic violence in the household. There was a lot of mental abuse, I suppose you call it. The film isn't really in two parts. The first part is showing the world of this family living underneath this despotic, almost psychotic father played by Pete Postlethwaite in an absolutely incredible performance. One of the great performances in British film. Once he dies, I think the energy does go out of the film, if I'm completely honest. Pete Postlethwaite's presence is so huge in the first part of the film that the rest of the film sort of falls away a bit. But it's an extraordinary piece. I really admire the truth of Terence Davies' portrait of this violent father and violent husband. He shows things in the film that a lesser director and a lesser writer would not know. And he knows it because he's been in that situation. There's a scene where it's Christmas time, the kids have gone to bed, the stockings are hanging on the end of the bed. Pete Postlethwaite sort of gingerly opens the door and with tears in his eyes said, "Good night, kids." It's because this is a man who believes in himself as the head of the family, the paterfamilias, who believes that he loves his kids, but can never express it to them personally, to their face. One scene of violence is Pete Postlethwaite is just sitting silent and impassive at the dinner table, and slowly he just scrunches up the tablecloth and wrecks the table. So powerful and so true. And then another scene that I think a lot of people who've not been in that situation or heard of that situation would not understand. Pete Postlethwaite dies, and his eldest daughter at the funeral is crying her eyes out saying, "I want my dad." I can't tell you how powerful that scene is to me. Because it's so true about human beings and people. A lesser director and lesser writer would not have put in that complexity, that shade of grey, into such a volatile situation. But Terence Davies understands people really well. A great film. Now, in third place, I'm going to put Terence Davies' original trilogy of short films. These are the films that he started making after film school, part of his graduation project. He made the film Children, then he followed it a few years later with Madonna and Child, and then finally Death and Transfiguration. And really, it's a sort of prototype of what he's going to cover in Distant Voices, Still Life and Long Day Closes, his childhood in the 1950s. So Children is about a man looking back at his childhood when he was bullied and the sort of school he went through and his misery. Madonna and Child is about a man who's now sort of in his 30s looking after an elderly, unfit mother and trying unsuccessfully to get his gay life going. There's a very, very funny sequence where you hear this phone call to this tattooist, and he's sort of tentatively and very shyly asking if he can get his penis tattooed. It's very funny, but it's also very sad and moving, as this guy is desperately trying to explore his desires, but he's trapped. And the third film, Death and Transfiguration, is a sort of triptych within a triptych, right? So it sort of replays these two ideas, one of the childhood, one of this man trapped looking after his mother, and then in the third episode, Wilfrid Bramble from Steptoe and Son plays the old man looking back at his life. I think this trilogy of films is incredibly beautiful. It's a very important moment in film, in British film history. I remember reading some of the people who went to film school with Terence Davies. They said, here's this quiet, shy young guy, used to be a shipping clerk, you know, up in Liverpool. And they think, what's he going to make? And then they saw Children, the first of his trilogy, and they were like, wow, this is emotionally overpowering. And that's how I felt when I first saw these films. I'd seen Distant Voices, Still Lives, I'd seen Long Day Closes, still wasn't sure about Terence Davies. But then I saw these little black and white films. I don't know if they're 16mm, they look it. And I thought, wow, this is what I was looking for in Terence Davies. It gets to the point, it gets to the core of what he wants to say about himself and his life. And I think they're easily overlooked, and I think they're really beautiful movies. In second place, though, I am going to pick The Long Day Closes, a film I've come round to. At first, I thought this is a kind of playlist, isn't it? It's just a series. There's 35 pieces of music in this film, in its short running time, all of which are played almost at total length, with sort of poetically, montaged images. And I was a bit dubious about it, but then I went back and watched it after I'd seen several of his films, and I realised that this is a tone poem, a beautiful reflection on childhood and coming of age by a really master director. And the use of music and image throughout is extraordinary. It teeters on the brink of being precious, right? It could be very precious. The opening shot is of some flowers, fading, over time. It teeters on the brink, but Davis has got such a powerful sense of the relationship between his boyhood games, swinging on a pole in an alleyway, and the link into going to church, and the link into Doris Day, and the wonder of going to the cinema in the 50s and being caught up in the light and the shadow, and all the way these things link together. And there's so many great remembrances of life in the 1950s. He brings it vividly to life. The other reason I really value this film is because I think it's the closest, actually, that Davis ever came to one of his great heroes, and one of mine, Humphrey Jennings. Humphrey Jennings was a wartime propaganda documentarist working in the 1940s. And Jennings, he was making, there were propaganda films, but there were documentaries about how ordinary people coped during the war. And one of the films he made was a film called Listen to Britain, which is a 14-minute film, which just it marries shots of England at war with a soundtrack of the sounds of war, of tanks rumbling through villages, BBC World Service programmes, to give a sense of an entire country just in 14 minutes, purely through sound and image. And, the art of Jennings lies in the choices and what he chooses to put together. In this film, I think that Terence Davies reaches the apogee of him trying to do that, of trying to evoke his childhood and post-war Liverpool through pure sound and image. There's one sequence that I really, really love and value, and it's where he marries a whole sequence to the end of a radio show. It's one of those old BBC radio shows. He goes, that was the BBC Light Orchestra, directed by Ken Adam, and the sound recordist was John Booth, and the singer was Mary Contrain. And that's sort of just the way that those credits are read really fast at the end of those old BBC radio programmes. And immediately that brings back to me so much of my own childhood, listening to Sunday afternoon radio programmes that my dad was listening to. It evokes that whole world of the old BBC. It gives you that powerful gut punch sense of the old world that's gone, in the way that Jennings's films gave you that gut punch sense of what Britain was at that time and what people were fighting for. And that's another reason I really value this film. I absolutely worship this film. I think it's a masterpiece, and perhaps the best expression Terence Davies had of himself in film. But my favourite Terence Davies film is actually House of Mirth. And this was the second film where he went out of his happy place, sort of 40s, 50s Liverpool. And now he adapts an Edith Wharton novel. He didn't actually make it in the States. He made it in Glasgow. Glasgow stood in for sort of turn of the century New York. But he adapted Edith Wharton's novel brilliantly, about this young socialite woman, very beautiful, very much sought after, but determined to make her own way and choose her own husband. And she comes a cropper through all sorts of bad luck. And the performances, Gillian Anderson is so good in the lead role. I don't know why her performance is not more garlanded. She's absolutely extraordinary. It's a very intense performance, showing the inner turmoil of this young woman, this very proud, very intelligent, very independent young woman who's sort of collapsing and imploding on herself. And wonderfully supported by Eric Stoltz. What happened to him? And Laura Linney, who's very good as the sort of nasty character in it. It's a brilliant period film, a very powerful story of a woman trying to make her way in a male world and failing. And actually, I think it's Terence Davies' most sustained work. I absolutely love it. I've often said that what I think is the finest compliment paid by one filmmaker to another is what Roberto Rossellini said about Charlie Chaplin, when Charlie Chaplin in the late 50s produced a film called A King in New York, which got a critical drubbing. No one liked it. But Rossellini said, it's the film of a free man, meaning it's a film made by someone who hasn't compromised himself and has followed his own path. And the greatest compliment I can pay to Terence Davies is that all his films are the films of a free man.